When James Buchanan became president, he was single. In fact, he's the only president who never married. So who's the first lady when the president is unmarried? And who was Buchanan's first lady? I'm Bob Summers, and this is a presidential story. The rumored love of James Buchanan's life was Anne Carolyn Coleman, who he met at an 1818 grand ball in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Coleman was connected to wealth and influence through her father, iron manufacturer Robert Coleman, and her sister's husband, Philadelphia judge Joseph Hemphill. By 1819, the 28-year-old Buchanan and 23-year-old Coleman were engaged, but did not spend a lot of time together. Buchanan was busy with his law firm and political projects, which took him away from Coleman for weeks at a time. During their time apart, Coleman started to hear rumors that Buchanan may be marrying her for her money or connections, or that he was involved with other unidentified women. No matter the truth, Coleman broke off the engagement and, sadly, died shortly thereafter. Buchanan wrote to Coleman's father for permission to attend the funeral. His request was denied. At the time, Buchanan said, quote, "I feel happiness has left from me forever." He buried himself in politics as a, quote, "distraction from my great grief." Buchanan never courted another woman again. Around 1840, 2 years after Buchanan's sister Jane died, Jane's widowed husband, Harriet Lane, also died, leaving behind 2 orphan children, one of whom was 10-year-old Harriet. Harriet asked her favorite uncle, whom she called Nunk, to become their legal guardians, which he did. In 1853, Buchanan was appointed U.S. ambassador to the United Kingdom and was joined by his niece. Lane made such a positive impression on Queen Victoria that she bestowed upon her the protocol status of ambassador's wife. When they returned to the United States in 1856, this diplomatic experience for the now 26-year-old Lane was helpful during Buchanan's campaign for the presidency, where she hosted several events to promote her uncle. You might see where this is going. When Buchanan won the election of 1856, Harriet Lane, his niece, became the First Lady. But before we explore more about Lane's legacy, let's take a look at the role of First Lady and those who were not married to the president. Not surprisingly, Martha Washington, wife to the first president, George, was also the first First Lady, although the term was not in use at the time. She was referred to as Lady Washington, and her role was that of White House hostess. The first reference to a First Lady was in an 1838 newspaper article about Martha Washington, 35 years after Lady Washington had died. The first person to have the First Lady title applied to her while she was holding the role was actually Harriet Lane, the niece of James Buchanan. The title itself did not gain widespread popularity and usage until 1877 and the presidency of Rutherford Hayes in reference to his wife, Lucy. Harriet was not the first non-wife to become First Lady. That honor belongs to Thomas Jefferson's daughter, Martha Jefferson Randolph. Jefferson's wife, also named Martha, died 19 years before he became president. In total, there have been 11 periods in time where the First Lady was not the president's wife. Those relationships were made up of 4 daughters-in-law, 3 daughters, 2 sisters, 1 niece-in-law, and of course, Buchanan's niece Harriet. This happened a lot more in the past. There has not been a non-wife First Lady since the second marriage of Woodrow Wilson in 1915. Back to Harriet Lane, after the sullen and gloomy term of First Lady Jane Pierce, Lane was a breath of fresh air. The young niece of the president was so popular that women copied her hair and clothing styles, especially when she lowered the neckline on her inaugural gown by 2.5 inches. Parents named their daughters for her, and the American public would name flowers, perfumes, poems, and clothing for her. And in 1857, Lane was honored as the namesake of a new steam-powered revenue cutter. It was the first revenue cutter named for a woman. Revenue cutter Harriet Lane later earned a place in history by firing the first naval shot of the American Civil War at Charleston, South Carolina. All of these honors elevated Harriet Lane to the level of American royalty. Some even wondered if she would actually become royalty. In 1860, Edward Albert, the Prince of Wales, paid a visit to the United States. His trip was followed closely by the press, which noted that the couple toured Mount Vernon, danced together, and played games of tenpins. Although they had a great time, nothing became of it. Speaking of royalty, the press hailed Lane as, quote, our Democratic queen. During this time of deep sectional politics, Lane still hosted formal White House dinners every week that would include leaders from the North and the South, taking special care to give dignitaries their proper precedence and still keep political foes apart. At these dinners, she also made a point of inviting artists and musicians to promote the arts. Lane possessed a combination of tact, poise, discretion, and political instinct that further enhanced her national popularity. Lane is also regarded by many as the first of the modern First Ladies because of her advocacy of social causes. While she was in England, Lane began to study, collect, and promote Native American arts. Her appreciation of indigenous artistic expression led to her tolerance of minorities in general and to her interest in the welfare of Native Americans in particular. She worked to educate lawmakers about the medical and educational needs of the various tribes, to remove Christian missionaries from their lands, and to stop the sale of liquor on the reservations. Because of her efforts, the Chippewa Nation heralded her as the Great Mother of the Indians. After the Buchanan presidency, Lane moved back to Wheatland in Pennsylvania with her uncle. There she met and at the age of 35 married Baltimore banker Henry Elliott Johnston. They had 2 sons, James Buchanan Johnston and Henry Elliott Johnston II. Within a year of each other, both teenage sons died of rheumatic fever. Less than 3 years after those tragedies, her husband died of pneumonia. As a 53-year-old childless widow, Mrs. Johnston threw herself into philanthropic work. None of her 6 siblings had lived to adulthood, and now, in memory of her 2 deceased sons, she dedicated $400,000, or over $12 million today, to establish the Harriet Lane Home for Invalid Children at the Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore, Maryland, with the stipulation that the facility treat patients of all races, creeds, and nationalities. Opening in 1912, the Harriet Lane Home was the first children's clinic in the United States to be associated with a medical school. Eventually treating over 60,000 children a year, the Harriet Lane Home became a pioneer treatment, teaching, and research clinic. Every 3 years since 1953, they have published the Harriet Lane Handbook, an authoritative resource for pediatric interns, residents, and practitioners. Harriet had long used her position to draw attention to the arts, including lobbying for a national art gallery. After her death in 1903, Mrs. Johnston's will left her art collection, based on European works, to a national art gallery. Eventually, this became the Smithsonian American Art Museum. After accepting her collection, the Smithsonian Institute called her the First Lady of the National Collection of Fine Arts. And one more item for her legacy, 2 more Coast Guard cutters were named for Harriet, including the 270-foot USCGS Harriet Lane, commissioned in 1984 and still in service today. Harriet Lane, President Buchanan's niece, was an impressive First Lady with a mostly forgotten legacy. It's a shame that her history has been tied to the legacy of what historians have rated one of history's worst presidencies. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, please help out the channel, like and subscribe. And please visit POTUS.com for more interesting facts about the presidents.